Well, thank you again, Brother Mark. Brothers and sisters, we come now to have a look at this second study, Upon This Rock I Will Build My Ecclesia. And we're going to have a look, of course, at Matthew 16, again as an introduction to the actual Transfiguration itself, which is recorded in chapter 17 of Matthew. So we want to show initially the context in which the Lord is transfigured. And it's in the context of the sign of the prophet Jonah that it occurs. And you have to go back to the beginning of chapter 15 to pick up the context that leads to chapter 16 and then on to the Transfiguration itself. Now Matthew 15 can be divided into two parts. In verses 1 to 20 we have the Lord Jesus Christ repudiating Judaism and the teachers of Judaism, the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes, etc. So that's what he does, and of course we know that context of how they complained about his disciples not washing their hands, etc., and he goes on to talk about what comes out of the heart of men. We're quite familiar with that context. So verses 1 to 20 is his repudiation of Judaism. But then of course we encountered in verse 21 the Lord deliberately going into the coasts of Tyre and Sidon, and there he meets this Syrophoenician woman. So whereas the first half of Matthew 15 is about the repudiation of Judaism, the second half of Matthew 15 is about the inclusion, the incorporation of Gentiles into the purpose of God. Got the picture? The chapter is divided down the middle. And he begins to talk about the sign of Jonah the prophet. Verse 22, he heals the daughter of the woman of Canaan. In fact, many of you will be aware that he doesn't use the severe term dogs. When he says to her, verse 26, he answered and said, "It is not meet to take the children's bread and to cast it to dogs." A dog was a despised creature. In New Testament times, mature dogs were not allowed in the house, but puppies were. So the word that he uses here at the end of verse 26 for dogs is not the normal word for a mature dog, which is kuon, K-U-O-N. It is kunarion, and kunarion means a little dog. A puppy, like the one upstairs now, all right, a little puppy. They were allowed inside the house, and of course they licked up the crumbs that fell from the table. And that's what she grabs. She says, "Lord, you've given me a lifeline. You've called me a little puppy. I want the crumbs. Please give me the crumbs." He says, "I haven't found faith like that in all Israel." So here we've got a conversion of a Gentile, see? And that's your context. Verse 29, it says he was nigh unto the Sea of Galilee. Now we know that Galilee is called in Isaiah 9 verse 1, Galilee of the nations. It was despised by Jewry because it was a place where many Gentiles lived. It had the Decapolis, the 10 Greek cities that had been built, 10 Greek and Roman cities that had been built there. In verse 31, there's an allusion to Isaiah 61 verse 1. Have a look what it says in verse 31. "Insomuch that the multitude wondered when they saw the dumb to speak, the maimed to be whole, the lame to walk." This is Isaiah 61 verse 1 that's being quoted. And it says at the end of that verse, "And they glorified the God of Israel." Now to glorify the God of Israel means that they were Gentiles, because if these were Jews, he would have said they glorified God. There wouldn't be a reference to the God of Israel. But it adds the phrase the God of Israel because the God of Israel hadn't been their God, but was now their God, because the Lord was in the process of converting them. And that phrase, of course, actually is picked up from Jonah itself. In Jonah chapter 1, maybe we've got time to do this, just hold your hand in Matthew 15 if you can. Have a look at Jonah chapter 1, and you'll see this language is picked up from there. We know the story of Jonah, and we're going to have a greater reference to it in a moment, because the Lord is clearly basing this section of Matthew 15 and of course the first half of Matthew 16 on the experiences of Jonah. Where is Jonah? Somewhere, here it is. Yeah, Jonah chapter 1 and verse 16. We read this. "Then," this is the sailors who threw Jonah overboard, "then the men feared Yahweh exceedingly, and offered a sacrifice unto Yahweh and made vows." How would you summarise that verse? Well, they glorified the God of Israel. Have a look at Jonah chapter 2, verses 8 and 9. When Jonah himself, having been released from his predicament, he says this, They that observe lying vanities forsake their own mercy, but I will sacrifice unto thee with the voice of thanksgiving. I will pay that I have vowed. Salvation is of Yahweh. So he's glorifying the God of Israel. In chapter 3 of Jonah and verse 5, we read that the king of Nineveh said this. Here's the king of Assyria. The people of Nineveh believed God, and proclaimed a fast, and put on sackcloth, from the greatest of them even to the least of them. In verse 8 we read, but let man and beast be covered with sackcloth, this is the king's decree, and cry mightily unto God. Yea, let them turn every one from his evil way and from the violence that is in their hands. So here we've got the king of Assyria glorifying the God of Israel. So you see, we're in the context of the sign of the prophet Jonah. And you'll see that that's very plain in a moment. In verse 32 of Matthew 15, we read these words. Then Jesus called his disciples unto him. I have compassion on the multitude, because they continue with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. Well, we know that 3 days plays a prominent part in Jonah, doesn't it? He's 3 days in the belly of the fish. But more than that, we read in Jonah 3 verse 3 that when he came to Nineveh, because it was a complex of cities, not just one city, it was 3 days' journey. So there were 4 cities, they were joined together by a wall. Nineveh was just one of them. To get across that entire compound took you 3 days. It was 60 miles. 60 miles wide. So it was a city of 3 days' journey. So 3 days is prominent in Jonah. And in verse 38 we read, and they that did eat were 4,000 men beside women and children. 4,000, of course, as we said, mostly Gentiles who are being brought into the covenant, because these are the ones who are glorifying the God of Israel. Now, the sign of the prophet Jonah, of course, was very important to our Lord Jesus Christ. Matthew 16 verse 4, we read this. They ask a sign. He says, a wicked and adulterous generation seeketh after a sign, and there shall no sign be given unto it but the sign of the prophet Jonah. He let them depart him. Now the foolish Pharisees, ignorant they were, in John chapter 7 verse 52 said, search and look, for out of Galilee ariseth no prophet. They were numbskulls. They had not read their Bible. Because in 2 Kings chapter 14 verse 25, we read that there was a prophet. He was the only one from Galilee. And his name was Jonah. The only Old Testament prophet from Galilee. He came from Gath-hepher, the winepress of the world it means. It was about 3 miles from Nazareth. I mean, Christ could have thrown a stone into the town of Jonah. So here we've got the ignorance of the Pharisees. They didn't even know that Jonah had come from the very place where the Lord Jesus Christ himself would grow up as a child and into manhood. The root of heifer, by the way, means to pry into, to search, to dig and to explore. Now, if they'd done a little bit of digging into their Bibles, they wouldn't have been ignoramuses, would they? And say that there's no prophet that comes out of Galilee. So here he was, very important to the Lord Jesus Christ. Now, Jonah means the dove. And the dove is the symbol of the Spirit. In Matthew 3 verse 16, he saw the Spirit of God descending upon the Lord like a dove. So when the dove came down, as it were, and settled on the Lord Jesus Christ, he was given the Spirit without measure. So it's a symbol for the Spirit of God. And he's the son of Amittai, is Jonah. And Amittai means voracious. It's from the word emeth. Now, emeth's very important in the divine scheme of things, because this is the word chosen by Yahweh on the mountain with Moses, Exodus 34 verse 6, to describe the most important characteristic of our God. Truthfulness, faithfulness, stability, covenant keeping. That's what emeth means. Emeth, truth and stability. It is the fundamental platform upon which the very character of our God stands. And everything he does is in terms of that particular characteristic. So here you've got Jonah, the dove, the symbol of the Spirit, the son of stability, divine stability, faithfulness and truthfulness. Get a bit of a feel for why Jonah was an important prophet? in the scheme of things as far as Christ was concerned. Now have a look at the hints to Jonah here. You're in Matthew 15 with me. Verse 39 of Matthew 15 says, and he sent away the multitude and took ship. Yeah. Well, Jonah chapter 1 verse 3 says, but Jonah rose up to flee and he found a ship going to Tarshish. He took ship and he sails away. In Matthew 16 verse 3 we read this, and in the morning it will be foul weather today. You can tell the weather. You look out and you see the sky. Yeah, it'll be foul weather today. Well, in Jonah chapter 1 verse 4, but Yahweh sent out a great wind into the sea and there was a mighty tempest in the sea. Yeah, Jonah encountered foul weather. See, it's quite plain, isn't it? Quite plain, just as our Lord Jesus Christ said, and behold, a greater than Jonah is here. Matthew 12 verse 41, that Jonah played a very significant part in his thinking as he came to the time of Transfiguration. And of course the pinnacle of the reference to Jonah is in Matthew 16 and verse 17. So turn a page with me to Matthew 16 and verse 17, where we read this. And Jesus answered and said unto Peter, blessed art thou, Simon Bar-Jonah. Simon Bar-Jonah. Simon, Simeon. Simon or Simeon means hearing. He's the hearing son of the Spirit. Oh, now that's what we were talking about in our last study. The importance of hearing the word of God. Flesh and blood hasn't revealed this unto you, Peter, but my Father in heaven, he's moulding you through the words that I speak. That's what's happening here. You've got a hearing son of the Spirit in Simon Peter. And he's going to express himself in a way that Christ grabs hold of and says, what you said, Peter, is the foundation, the rock upon which I'm going to build my Ecclesia. And have a look at that here in this study. So Jonah, we know, was evading his duty to preach to Gentiles when he took ship. He was escaping from Joppa, wasn't he? To get away from doing his duty in preaching to Gentiles. Peter was to be tested at Joppa. Because he came there and he received messengers from Cornelius, all right, who asked him to come and join a Gentile house, which the Jews, of course, took umbrage at. And he was heavily criticised by some of his fellows for going to the house of Cornelius. But he was seriously tested, wasn't he? Was he willing to use the keys of the kingdom, which we're going to see in our study, refer to the sufferings of Christ and the glory that would follow, as it's spelled out for us in 1 Peter 1 verse 11. We'll come to that a little later on. Was he prepared to use the keys of the kingdom to open the door of faith to the Gentiles in Acts chapter 10? Well, 3 times he had to have, didn't he, this napkin lowered in front of him, full of unclean animals. Arise, Peter, kill and eat. Oh, I don't touch that stuff. 3 times to get the message. So here you've got Peter having to go through the very same experience as Jonah. But Peter's declaration in Matthew 16 verse 22, Peter took Christ and he said, he rebuked his master and said, Lord, be it far from thee. This shall not be unto thee. This is not going to happen to you. You're not going to die. It's a little bit like Acts chapter 10 verse 14. Not so, Lord. I've never eaten anything unclean. So he had to go through the process of having his mind open to the fact that the Lord Jesus Christ would perform his work not just for Jew. He would perform it for Jew and Gentile, which is why Matthew 15's there. Which is why Matthew 15's divided into 2 parts. Repudiation of Judaism in the first half and the acceptance of Gentiles in the second half. That's why it's there. That's why Jonah is brought into the picture. And that's why Peter is playing such an important role here, because he's got to learn that he's going to take these keys of the kingdom and use them to both Jew and Gentile, as we will see in our studies. So who is this man, Peter? Well, he's called Cephas in John 1:42, which means a rock or a stone. Matthew 16 verse 18. I'm just going to read down here. Let's just pick up this context from verse 13 and read down from Matthew 16, verse 13 to verse 18, so that clear in our mind again. When Jesus came to the coast of Caesarea Philippi, and we know why he was there, he asked his disciples, saying, "Whom do the men, the Sadducees and the Pharisees, say that I, the Son of Man, am?" And they said, "Well, some are saying you're John the Baptist, some are saying you're Elijah, others are saying you're Jeremiah or one of the other prophets." But he said unto them in verse 15, "But who do you say I am?" And Peter, Simon Peter, notice what Simon, the hearing rock, Simon Peter answered and said, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered and said unto him, "Blessed art thou, the hearing Son of the Spirit, for flesh and blood hath not revealed it unto thee, but my Father which is in heaven. And I say also unto thee that thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my Ecclesia, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." You know, when you analyse those verses, they're absolutely jam-packed with meaning. We want to explore some of the things that Christ is saying here. Thou art Peter, he says. Now, Peter is the Greek Petros. It means a piece of rock or a stone, like one you can pick up in a creek bed. You know, the ones that are rolled around when the water runs down the creek bed, and their sharp edges are eventually worn off, like the smooth stones that David picked up in a creek bed. They're movable. When water comes along, they're movable. That's what his name means. But upon this rock will I build my Ecclesia is a different word. Oh yeah, it's cognate, but it's Petra. You know, they named the place, didn't they? You can go to Petra today. Why do they call it Petra? Well, when you enter it from the northern side, the northwestern side, northeastern side, get it right in a minute, you enter into this narrow defile. And if you've been there, it's awe-inspiring. Hundreds of feet high. And you wander for a mile or more down this narrow defile. It's a huge cliff, a mass of rock. That's what a Petra is. It's quite different than a Petros. A Petros is a piece of rock moved by the water in a creek bed. A Petra is a mass of rock, a cliff, a ledge or a platform. So Peter was to prove himself to still be a movable rock. When he came into the house of Simon the tanner at Joppa, he was very movable, wasn't he? He had to see the vision 3 times. Get your act together, come on. Alright? He was movable. But the statement that he made before Christ is transfigured is a massive, immovable foundation stone. So what came out of his mouth is the immovable rock upon which Christ would build his Ecclesia. The statement that he made in verse 16. Thou art the anointed. You're the Messiah. We know that. The Son of the living God. That's the statement. That's the rock upon which the Ecclesia was to be built. Got the point of that? That, brothers and sisters, is why Peter plays such an important part in this development to the Transfiguration, as does the prophet Jonah. So, I want you to have a look a little closer at what the Lord says here about the Transfiguration and the contrasts that are made between those who are involved in the process. Remember what he said in verse 13? Whom do the men say that I am? But have a look at chapter 17, verse 5, in the Transfiguration. While he yet spake, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and behold, a voice out of the cloud which said, This is my beloved Son. In him I am well pleased. Hear ye him. So the men, the Pharisees and the Sadducees were saying, oh, he might be one of the prophets. When God speaks, he's the Son of God, my beloved Son. So there's contrast to be made here. The contrast is between men and God. Flesh and blood hath not revealed this unto you, Peter, but my Father. Difference between men and God. So John the Baptist, they said. He's John the Baptist, or he's Elijah, or he's Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. My beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased. Flesh and blood's not revealed this. My Father in heaven. Peter, movable, stone, upon this rock. Petra, immovable statement. The gates of hell, contrasted with the keys of the kingdom. Bit of difference there, isn't there? That's what man gives you. That's what God gives you. Suffer, be killed, that's what men do to you. Glory of his Father. That's what God would do for Christ. Men, get thee behind me, Satan. Christ has to say to Peter, you do not countenance the things that belong to God, in saying what you've said a little later on in Matthew 16. But then he says to him, blessed art thou, Simon, in verse 17 and 18. See the idea here? You've got the difference between men and God. That's what the Transfiguration is really all about. So I want to come to these keys of the kingdom, the subject of verse 19 of Matthew 16. And I will give unto thee the keys of the kingdom, says Christ to Peter, the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And whatsoever thou shalt bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever thou shalt loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Now, how do we understand that? Well, you're going to see in a moment exactly what that means. But the key thing here, if I might use that word, the key thing here about the two keys is that this language is actually being drawn from the Old Testament. So I'd like you to have something, if you can, in Matthew 16. And I want you to come back with me to Isaiah chapter 22, because this is where this language is drawn from. Isaiah 22 and the context surrounding verse 22. So I'm going to read from verse 20 of Isaiah 22. And it shall come to pass in that day that I will call my servant Eliakim, whose name means Ale shall set up, the son of Hilkiah. Now Eliakim in this context is set forth as a type of Christ. Verse 21. And I will clothe him with thy robe and strengthen him with thy girdle. I will commit thy government into his hand, and he shall be a father to the inhabitants of Jerusalem and to the house of Judah. Now look at this verse, verse 22. And the key of the house of David will I lay upon his shoulder, so he shall open, and none shall shut. And he shall shut, and none shall open. And I will fasten him as a nail in the sure place, and he shall be for as it should read, a throne of glory to his father's house. So here we've got clearly a reference to the Lord Jesus Christ, who's seen typically in the person Eliakim, one of the faithful ministers of Hezekiah. Whereas, of course, Shebna is contrasted, verses 15 through 19, contrast Shebna, who's called the one who's the treasurer over the house. He's an unfaithful man. So there's a contrast made between these two men. And Eliakim clearly sets forth a type of Christ. So what does it say about these keys, or the key of the house of David that would be given to him? Well, when he got that key, it says in verse 22 that he will open, none will shut. He will shut and none will open. So the two keys that were given to Peter, we are going to find actually have their roots back here in Isaiah. And here's the first one. The first key is referenced in Isaiah 22 verse 22. And these two keys that were given to Peter were the sufferings of Christ and the glory that should follow. Now I'm going to show you in a moment a series of passages in 1 Peter. And 1 Peter 1 verse 11 is where these words that you can see in green are drawn from. They set forth what the two keys of the kingdom actually are. And I'll prove this to you beyond all dispute. There's no question about it, as you'll see in a moment. But you see, that's why the statement is made in Matthew 16. And I'm not going to lose Isaiah because I'm going to be back here shortly. In Matthew 16, Christ says, I will give unto thee the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatsoever thou shalt bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever thou shalt loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. In other words, What the apostles would do, and particularly Peter, is that they would use a key to unlock knowledge of the things of the kingdom of God, of the work of God in Christ. They would use those keys to unlock. And once unlocked, nobody's going to shut it. That's what the point's being made. No one's going to shut it because it's come from heaven. It's commissioned from heaven. And I'll give you a translation in a minute that will demonstrate that. But let's just carry on here. These keys are mentioned together at least 7 times in the first of Peter, and we're going to note them later on, and it's not a bad idea to highlight them. Peter used both keys twice. Notice that. Now, it's commonly thought in our community that he uses 2 keys, one to the Jews and one to the Gentiles. Wrong. Alright? He uses 2 keys twice. He uses both keys to the Jews first in Acts 2 and both keys to the Gentiles in Acts 10. And I'll show that to you in a moment. But I want you to notice something else that is said in Matthew 16 and at verse 18. He says, "Thou art Peter, and upon this rock, this immovable statement of yours, that I am the anointed, the Son of the living God, I will build my ecclesia. And the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." Now, where's that phrase from? Well, it's from Isaiah 38, verse 10. I should come back. I've got Isaiah still open. Isaiah 38, verse 10. Now, this is the song of Hezekiah after he was healed from his deadly sickness. He was going to die. He was going to go to the gates of Sheol. But he was rescued from it. So the gates of Sheol did not prevail over Hezekiah on that occasion. He was given 15 more years of life. So look what he says in his song in Isaiah 38 verse 10. Maybe verse 9. "The writing of Hezekiah king of Judah when he had been sick and was recovered of his sickness. I said in the cutting off of my days, I shall go to the gates of the grave." Hebrew, Sheol. In the Greek, of course, it's Hades. "I am deprived of the residue of my years." So that's where that phrase comes from. Now, why would that be the case, brothers and sisters? Well, because Hezekiah was the suffering servant of Yahweh, who's the type of Christ in Isaiah 53. You know what it says about Hezekiah? No, it says about Christ. His visage was marred more than any man. Remember that? What does that mean? Well, Hezekiah wasn't married when he fell sick. Why wasn't Hezekiah married? He's a king, after all. Why wasn't he married? Well, because his father Ahaz had put him on the arms of Molech when he was a baby. And he was passed through the fire. You know what happens when you put someone and roast them over a fire? They come out with all blotches, red burns all over their body. And Hezekiah was placed on the arms of Molech by his hideously faithless father, Ahaz. Oh yeah, he took him off because he's going to be his successor. But he offered him to Molech first. And this man's face was so marred, he couldn't bring himself to take a wife. He didn't want a woman to look into his hideously marred visage. His face was marred more than any man. Yeah, Hezekiah was a wonderful type of the suffering servant of Yahweh, who was brought to the gates of Sheol, but the gates of Sheol did not prevail against him. He was raised from the dead, so to speak. Got the picture? That's why Christ is quoting that. So out of Isaiah, he's got 2 keys. The sufferings of Christ and the glory that would follow. The 2 keys of the kingdom of heaven. So let's explore this a little further. The keys provide access, but only if used in the correct manner. "Whatsoever thou mayest bind upon the earth shall, having been bound in the heavens." Young's literal translation. In other words, whatever you bind on earth got to come from heaven. Don't bring men into this. You're going to teach the word of God, then teach it as it was taught from heaven. That's what he's saying. You know what Peter says in his epistle? If any man speak, let him speak as though he was God speaking. That's what he says. Let him speak as the oracles of God, as though he's God speaking. That's binding from heaven. Got it? This is not like the Catholics interpret this. The Catholics interpret it another way, don't they? That whatever decision the Pope makes, whatever that might be, even if God disagrees with it, it's bound on earth. Well, that's ridiculous. That's what it means. So here we've got the two keys. The sufferings of Christ and the glory would follow. So are they in this context of Matthew 16? Let's have a look at it. Matthew 16. Verse 21. From that time forth began Jesus to show unto his disciples how that he must go unto Jerusalem and suffer many things of the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed. Yeah, there's the sufferings of Christ. But how does the verse end? And be raised again the third day. It ends with the glory of immortality after 3 days in the grave. Verse 25, he makes this point to his disciples. For whosoever will save his life shall lose it. Whosoever will lose his life for my sake shall find it. So if you lose your life, if you follow his example, you'll find life eternally. Look at verse 24. Jesus said to his disciples, if any man will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross. Yeah, after the pattern of the sufferings of Christ. But look at verse 27. For the Son of Man shall come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and then he shall reward every man with that glory. So you've got the contrast. Suffering leads to glory, rewarding every man. In verse 23 we read that Peter, who has said to the Lord, this is not going to happen to you, Lord. Christ turns to him in verse 23 and said unto Peter, get thee behind me, Satan. You're an offence to me, stumbling block. But in verse 28 he says to the same man, verily I say unto you, there be some standing here which shall not taste of death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. And Peter was the leading disciple to go up that mountain with his two fellows to see Christ in the glory of the kingdom. So you see the contrast? The sufferings of Christ and the glory that would follow. There's a principle here, brothers and sisters, and we sing it in one of our hymns. The cross must come before the crown. You want the crown? Then take up the cross first. That's the principle. The sufferings of Christ and the glory that follows. So these keys of the kingdom, these keys that Peter has given, are based upon Peter's declaration of the foundation of Christ's Ecclesia. Upon that statement, thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God, I will build my Ecclesia. Peter, you're still movable, but that statement is immovable. It's right, it's true, and you're about to see it. Because on the Mount of Transfiguration, he's seen as he will be seen in the kingdom. In Matthew 16, verses 21 to 28, we see the sufferings must precede the glory. You know, Psalm 22, that psalm that is quoted twice out of 7 sayings on the cross, twice, comes from the mouth of our Lord Jesus Christ. That psalm is structured on the basis of the 2 keys of the kingdom of heaven. We know, I'll come to that in a second. And that's why Peter says in his first epistle, searching what? Or what manner of time the Spirit of Christ, which was in the psalmists and in the prophets of old, did signify, when it testified beforehand the sufferings of Christ and the glory that should follow. There's your 2 keys mentioned in Peter's first epistle. Now have a quick look with me at Psalm 22. You might want to come back to Psalm 22. This wonderful messianic psalm which gave our Lord Jesus Christ minute detail of his sufferings on the cross. There is no psalm that comes within a bull's roar of this one when it comes to telling him exactly what he would go through in the 6 hours that he laboured on the cross until death. So Psalm 22 fulfills a very important role in the work and mission of Christ. Now these are not David's words, although of course he's the author of the psalm. At the heading of Psalm 22, the words to the chief musician upon Ageleth Shahar belong to Psalm 21. the words that belong to Psalm 22 are a Psalm of David. And we know, of course, because this psalm is quoted. And we're told it's from the Psalm of David. But they're not David's words. Just like we read in 1 Peter chapter 1 verse 11. These are the words of David as though he were Christ. The Spirit of Christ that was in them, said Peter. So this is really Christ speaking through David. Now there are two parts to Psalm 22 which reveal the two keys to the kingdom. There is verse 1 to 21 part A. So you've got 21. Verse 21 says this: "Save me from the lion's mouth." Now you can put some kind of diagonal line after the word mouth, because that is the first half of the psalm. That's the section of the psalm that deals with the sufferings of Christ in very great detail. But then you've got from verse 21b to the end of the psalm, to verse 31. "For thou hast heard me from the horns of the unicorns," or from the altar. That's, of course, Christ being raised from the dead. And then the language that follows is clearly about his resurrection and his glorification. He says in verse 22, "I will declare thy name unto my brethren in the midst of the congregation, the quahal, the ecclesia, will I praise thee." That's picked up by Paul in Hebrews 2 verse 12, when he talks about the captain of our salvation bringing many sons unto glory. He quotes that verse. So we know that the second half of Psalm 22 is all about the glory that would follow. And if you read through those words, and I'm not going to do it now, you will see that the subject matter is Christ's glory in the kingdom age. So first half, sufferings. Second half, the glory that would follow. You have got the two keys of the kingdom in Psalm 22. And Psalm 22 just happens to be based upon Genesis 22. And if you have a look at verse 4, verse 23, verses 27 to 28, and 30 to 31, you will find language that comes from Genesis 22. Why? Why? Well, Genesis 22 is when Yahweh asked Abraham to play his part in a wonderful enacted parable of the sacrifice of Christ. When father and son went together to the very place where David put the head of Goliath, to one of the hills of Moriah, and there they played out the sacrifice of Christ and the resurrection of Christ from the dead. That's why. Now, that's all I'm going to say about that. There's a lot more links than that. But Psalm 22 is based upon Genesis 22, which is why it derives much of its language from it. So let's go back to these keys, shall we? I want to just nail this down so that it's obvious that this is what is being said in Matthew 16, that the two keys are about the sufferings of Christ and the glory that would follow. I want you to come to 1 Peter with me. Now here's a little exercise that you can do if you wish. Those passages that you can see on the screen, I'm going to go through each one of those, and you may not want to do this immediately, but at some point I would suggest that if you really want to understand what 1 Peter's about, then this is a key to it. He's talking about the two keys of the kingdom of heaven in the first epistle. Interestingly enough, he talks about the Transfiguration in his second epistle. Accident, you think? Don't think so. So you've got the keys of the kingdom, Matthew 16 in the first epistle. You have the Transfiguration, Matthew 17, in his second epistle. That's not accidental. Now these keys are mentioned together at least 7 times in the first of Peter. We're going to start in chapter 1, verses 2 to 4. I'm not going to read too much of verse 3, just the last couple of lines. Verse 2 says, "Elect according to the foreknowledge of God the Father through sanctification of the Spirit, unto obedience and sprinkling of the blood of Jesus Christ." Sufferings of Christ. End of verse 3. "Unto a living hope by the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, to an inheritance incorruptible and undefiled, and that fadeth not away, the glory that would follow." Now that formula that we spoke about comes from verse 11. So let's read verse 11 again, at the end of the verse. when it testified beforehand the sufferings of Christ, key number 1, and the glory that would follow, key number 2. Have a look at chapter 1, verses 19 to 21. 1 Peter 1, verse 19. He says, we are redeemed with the precious blood of Christ, as of a lamb without blemish and without spot. Sufferings of Christ. Look at verse 21. Who by him do believe in God, that raised him up from the dead and gave him glory. Key number 2. Have a look at chapter 3, verses 18 to 22. So we go along a bit further in the first of Peter. Chapter 3, verse 18. For Christ also hath once suffered for sins. Have a look at the end of the verse. But quickened by the Spirit. Look at verse 22. Who is gone into heaven and is on the right hand of God, angels and authorities and powers being made subject unto him, the glory that would follow. So there's suffering and there's glory. Have a look at chapter 4, verse 1. For as much then as Christ hath suffered. Where does that end up? Look at verse 11. It says at the end or the middle of the verse, that God in all things may be glorified through Jesus Christ. Look at verse 13. But rejoice, inasmuch as ye are partakers of Christ's sufferings, key 1, that when his glory shall be revealed, ye may be glad also with exceeding joy, key 2. And finally, chapter 5, verse 1. So if you're not convinced by now, I take out the sledgehammer. All right? This is a sledgehammer. Chapter 5, verse 1. The elders which are among you I exhort, who am also an elder, and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, and also a partaker of the glory that shall be revealed. It's all over. Coup de grace. Isn't it? The 2 keys of the kingdom of heaven are the sufferings of Christ and the glory that would follow. Now, how were they used? Well, Peter used the keys twice. Acts 2. Come with me to Acts 2. You can do that little exercise later on. You can catch up. We can give you the copy of this. You can catch up with those verses. But it's well worth doing a little exercise in 1 Peter. It'll make a lot more sense to you next time you read it. Now come to Acts chapter 2. This is Peter's address on the day of Pentecost to a multitude not less than 3,000 people. There's a lot of people baptised on this day. Now why? Why did they suddenly see the light? Well, he used the key to unlock a door. You know, they were behind a closed door. He uses the keys of the kingdom of heaven. So what keys were they? Well, in Acts 2, have a look at verses 23 and 24. When he gets into the meat of his address on the day of Pentecost, he says this in verse 23. Him, Christ, being delivered by the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God, ye have taken and by wicked hands have crucified and slain, whom God hath raised up, having loosed the pains of death. Yeah, the sufferings of Christ. Key 1. Because it was not possible. He should be holden of it. But where does it end up? Well, look at verse 33. Verse 33. Verse 32 perhaps for connection. This Jesus hath God raised up, whereof we are all witnesses. Therefore, being by the right hand of God exalted, and having received of the Father the promise of the Holy Spirit, etc. There's the glory of Christ. So you've got the sufferings in verses 23, 24. You've got the glory in verse 33. So there Peter is using the 2 keys together on the day of Pentecost to the Jews. But he uses them a second time. Come to Acts chapter 10. He uses them in Acts 10 to the Gentiles. It's on the record of Acts 10, he's come to the house of Cornelius. And he begins to address them. Look what he says in verse 39. And he says this, maybe verse 38. How God anointed Jesus of Nazareth with the Holy Spirit and with power, who went about doing good and healing all that were oppressed of the devil, for God was with him. And we are witnesses of all these, of all things which he did, both in the land of the Jews and in Jerusalem, whom they slew and hanged on a tree. Key 1. Him God raised up the third day and showed him openly. Key 2. Got it? So both keys are used again in the house of Cornelius. 2 keys of the kingdom of heaven. Now what I'm doing right now is showing you the first slide of the next study. This is the context of the Transfiguration. Matthew 16 ends with a promise. There'll be some standing here that will not taste of death. That sounds like suffering to me. Until they see the kingdom of God come. That sounds like the glory to me. That's how Matthew 16 ends. And he meant 3 disciples. One of them was the man who would use the keys of the kingdom of heaven to both Jew and Gentile. His name was Petros, an immovable stone. But when he used the keys, he was laying a platform that was immovable. Thou art the anointed, the Son of the living God. And they're about to hear a voice. This is my Son, the beloved, whom I'm well pleased. We've had a look at all the introduction. And now we're going to see the time of the apocalypse of Christ in Matthew 17 verse 2. The resurrection of the dead in verses 6 and 7. The saints appearing in glory in verse 3. Elijah coming to restore Israel in verse 11. A great mountain, Babylon the Great, removed in verse 20. And mankind cured of falling sickness, the disease they got from Adam. And the mustard seed, the kingdom of God, filling the whole earth. And all of that is in the transfiguration of Christ. See why it was necessary to spend time to get here? In our next study, God willing, the Son of Man will be seen coming in his kingdom.